Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this video, I would like to talk about exclusion. Why? Because I'm a heartless troll? Not necessarily, although that might be true, not sure. No, because we often hear about inclusion, and in those conversations centering on diversity and equity and other things besides, exclusion is usually described as an utterly terrible, unforgivable act. It's intolerant, it's bigoted, it's backwards, it's ... fill in the appropriate blank, whatever, okay? So I want to talk about how exclusion is appropriate, sometimes necessary, even loving, if it's understood in the right way and practiced in the right way. I don't want to talk so much about the societal or the cultural implications. That's a huge conversation. But I do want to think about the ecclesial implications. So let's get into it. Okay. All right. So let's just appeal to an experience that you may or may not have had, and then let's sort through our intuitions on exclusion and then make a little proposal. So first, maybe you have experienced an ecumenical endeavor of some sort. Maybe it was good. Maybe it was not good. Okay. I live in Europe, specifically in Switzerland. The way that ecumenism is practiced here is sometimes not good. Okay. What do I have in mind? Well, there's this sense that if you're going to participate in this thing, it has to be least common denominator ecumenism. So whatever is it that you believe or that you profess, you have to leave some of that at the door for fear of offending somebody or alienating somebody. And sometimes you'll see this taken to great lengths or extents when, whoever is leading the group says, we're all basically the same, or it doesn't matter what you believe so much as you believe it firmly, and there's just different ways of going to God, and you're there like, I'm uncomfortable. Or it might be more kind of practical in the sense that it's scheduled at a time such that you can't go to Mass. It's in conflict with Mass. Like I was talking to somebody recently who had an ecumenical, like a necessary or mandatory ecumenical endeavor scheduled at the same time as Holy Thursday Mass, the Mass of the Lord's Supper. It's like, okay, so you're sending me the signal that if I'm going to participate in this ecumenism, I need to retreat from my Catholicism, which is crazy town, okay? So the thing that's weird about this is that it's often done under the banner of inclusion, but it ends up producing a falsity. It ends up producing a lie. So I want to think about how exclusion may in fact be called for in the ecclesial circumstances. But in order to do that, let's sort through some intuitions. Okay, so there are certainly examples of bad exclusion. This would be when you are excluded for arbitrary or prejudicial or unjust reasons. Okay, so, crazy town. So, classic example, to be excluded on the basis of race or color. You can think about Major League Baseball. Black players could not participate until well into the league's history. So that's bad. Okay. Good exclusion. There are other forms of exclusion which we would just say unequivocally are good. And a lot of these would be based on age or competence or development. So for instance, you've got these various stages at which you are then permitted to do things. So at 16, you can drive in most states. At 18, you can purchase cigarettes and you can vote. At 21, you can drink. At 25, I think you can be elected to the House of Representatives, ... whatever. You know that there are certain ages that you have to hit in order to be able to do certain things or be availables for certain things. And I think a lot of us, we might quibble over the details, but a lot of us think that it's good in some way. Okay, now there are limit cases, so there are murky cases. So for instance, we talked about race, color on the basis of arbitrary or prejudicial or unjust exclusion. But what if we're talking about an African American students club? Okay, I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm just saying it's murkier. It's less clear. So what if you're African? Like both of your parents are from Africa and you were born in Africa. Or what if you're white American? Should you be able to participate in this thing? More apropos still, what if it's a Catholic student association at a college? Should you be able to elect, like a president, a vice president, a treasurer who are non-Catholic? Or could you legislate that they ought to be Catholic? So this particular instance came up at Vanderbilt University, and the university insisted that all students ought to be eligible, and then the Catholic student group just disaffiliated or unaffiliated from the university, moved off campus, and then went by the moniker University Catholic. So this actually happened. So that would be an example of a murky case. Now, what type of exclusion are we talking about with ecclesial exclusion? When we say, you can participate to a certain extent, but you can't do this. Or if I'm going to participate, I need to be able to participate in the way that is appropriate to me as a professing Catholic. These are the types of things that we're thinking about. We're going to focus especially on reception of Holy Communion. So I think it's sometimes construed by those who want least common denominator stuff as if it were racism to exclude. And I think that is wrong. Okay? Now you might swing in the other direction and say, well, it's more like age or competence or development. Well, there are some kind of points of similarity, but in the case of the Catholic Church, everyone can become a member of the Catholic Church at whatever age. So all are potentially members of the Catholic Church. All are potentially members of the body of Christ. Now, I recorded a video recently on the question of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. So this idea that if you are saved, you're saved by Christ in the Catholic Church. So following the teaching of Lumen Gentium, the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. The way that's interpreted by the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith in subsequent years is that, it is the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church has the fullness, as it were. It has all of those means of, grace and sanctification at its disposal. So the fullness of faith, the fullness of sacraments, the fullness of governance. Okay. Now, we also said that the invisible church, we're not going to say that the invisible church floats free of the visible church, but that the invisible church kind of spills over the bounds of the visible church. And so we find elements of grace and salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So you might have true faith or some of the sacraments or even all of the sacraments in the case of the Orthodox, or following of the covenant in the case of the Jews, worship of the one God in the case of the Muslims, etc. Okay, so it's a somewhat murky question insofar as we're adjudicating where are present these elements of grace and salvation, and then how they pertain to Catholic communion, and then what the trajectory of that is. Okay, so then what type of exclusion are we talking about here when, for instance, at an ecumenical event, we say if we're going to have a Mass, you're not permitted to receive Holy Communion, or if we have a wedding, a similar announcement might be made at the beginning of the distribution of Holy Communion, okay? So to a lot of people in the ambient culture, that seems like a rejection, it seems like intolerance, bigotry, whatever we've called it previously. But truth be told, I want to propose to you that it's actually loving, okay? It's the best way by which to approach the situation, okay? The analogy that I want to use to situate ourselves between bad exclusion and good exclusion, well, really to situate ourselves in terms of what the good exclusion is at stake, is marriage. So the analogy that I want to use is marriage. So in marriage, you limit yourself, okay? And in limiting yourself, you are excluding things, okay? So you marry one person, you're excluding the possibility of marrying other people. Now, there are cases in which people do that, right? So they get married, they divorce, they remarry again, or they might engage in bigamy or polygamy or polyandry, or they might, be serial fornicators or in open marriages. There are any number of ways in which people, pair off in multiple ways. So not to talk about that too terribly much. I'm just talking about sacramental marriage. The ordinary means is that you would consent to a bond that lasts until the death of one of the spouses. And in consenting, you limit yourself. And in limiting yourself, you exclude other options for yourself, but you also exclude options for other people, okay? So the bond is intended to be that way. It's intended to be exclusive. Why? For exclusion's sake? No, because it actually conduces to the holiness of the partners, because one becomes assigned to the other of sanctification, and so too vice versa, and that is fruitful, okay? Specifically, it's fruitful in the life of grace for the spouses, but it's also fruitful in physical life and in, beyond physical life for their children. So the exclusion is kind of accidental to the union, and the union is for the sanctification of the spouses and the sanctification of their children. So there's a kind of covenantal logic here, and the covenantal logic places demands on both parties. It places a claim on both parties, and as a result of which, there's a kind of exclusion that flows from that. So for instance, it would be weird to wife share. If somebody were to say, how dare you, in marrying this one person, forbid her to have sexual intercourse with other persons? It's like, weird, okay. It sounds like something proposed by a utopian society of the 19th century that just forgot about the fact of original sin. So we're talking about a covenant, okay? Now, I think that that's kind of something like what we are seeing in ecclesial exclusion. So there are certain things that are reserved for Catholics in good standing or in a fit state to receive, like we gestured towards the reception of Holy Communion. And this is prescribed by Catholic law. And also intercommunion, like who is permitted to receive, is also prescribed by Catholic law. But Catholics have the competence to do this. The Church has the competence to do this, to make these types of judgments, because it's part of her covenantal logic. It's part of the exclusive bond which she has made with her members, which conduces to the holiness of those members who partake in the holiness of Christ himself. So Catholics have chosen that. But in a certain sense, non-Catholics have also chosen not that, or they have not chosen that. All right, they're free to do so. They can do so. The call remains open for them to do so, but they haven't. Okay, so then the rules are made, as it were, or the law is crafted with an eye towards building up the life of the church and its members. It's not made with an eye towards exclusion, like, the fathers of the church got together and said, how can we do most harm to those who aren't Catholics so as to ensure that they will be disappointed perpetually at the fact of their not being Catholic? No, that's not the point. The exclusion is, as it were, accidental. It's part of the covenantal logic, but the point is the covenant. So, and in addition, the invitation to become Catholic remains open, but if you continually deaden the difference between Catholicism and other things which aren't Catholicism, then that invitation is not proffered with the same kind of intensity, with the same kind of, urgency. And I think that's super important, because as Catholics, we believe that we genuinely sit at a banquet table, that we have all of the elements of grace and salvation, that we have the fullness, that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, and it should be for us to share that, to proclaim that, to teach that, to affirm that. I'm going to stop repeating different verbs. But if we were to say that, everyone's welcome and we're not going to make any distinctions and yada, yada, thus and such, then we actually deaden the proclamation of the faith and our affirmation of the same, and we make it harder in turn for people to be attracted by the truth which is present in the Catholic Church. Because when we fail to make distinctions, then everyone becomes a superhero, which means that no one is a superhero, okay? So there is a way forward for one who would partake of Catholic communion, and the ordinary way is to become Catholic. It's just to become Catholic, and that's not imperialistic or colonialistic to say. It's a genuine invitation to the fullness of life which Christ has revealed and instituted by his church, which is his body. So I can say that I want everyone to be Catholic, and that's not just because I need other people in my communion to build me up in a kind of argument of persuasion that I have in fact made the right choice. It's because I believe, by virtue of the fact that God reveals that what is true is in fact true. So this should inform our teaching and our preaching, and it should become an occasion of attraction for those addressed by that proclamation. So I would say this: don't fear to exclude. It's always going to be uncomfortable to exclude, but don't fear to exclude, because it's actually merciful. So what is mercy? It's to address somebody in his or her state of misery and then to go about the best way of alleviating that misery, which leads to fullness of life. And in this case, it's miserable not to have the banquet laid before you, because you can see the banquet. But that desire for the banquet needs to be stirred up by insisting on a participation in the banquet which is genuine, which is real, which isn't premised on a lie. Okay? So I'd say the exclusion is good insofar as it ultimately redounds, or it conduces to inclusion. Because again, I want everyone to be Catholic because it's awesome. Okay. All right. I hope that was helpful. That's what I prepared to say, so I said it. Cheers. This is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, and get other emails as they come forth. Come forth. That sounds so dramatic. Also, I contribute to a podcast which is called Godsplaining. I do it with 4 other Dominican friars, and we have episodes about all kinds of stuff. But we did one about Extra Ecclesiam Nella Salus, so you might check that one out in particular. And then third and finally, I wrote a book, and that book is called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. And I think it's good. And I think that you'll profit from it. So pick it up and let me know how it goes. All right. Know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me. And I look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.